Okay, welcome to the C Files, folks. Thanks for joining me. And I come to the final reading of this evening. And this is The Battle for Christmas, Pulitzer Prize finalist by Stefan Nessenbaum, A Cultural History of America's Most Cherished Holiday. This is all about the history of Christmas in America, in the United States. And we're on page 55 in this reading. And this is talking about as it's going through kind of a transition from almost like a Halloween wassailer invasive type of celebration um, to where it's trying to become more of what it is today, but it's going through a transition. And so there was some of the wassailing the old ways, the noise and the wild parties, and then going into people's houses and saying you have to feed me and all this. That was some of that was still going on. So we're going to pick up on a testament here as to why this particular gentleman, John Pittard, thinks this was happening. This is called Knickerbocker Holiday. Let's read what it has to say. Let us return for a few minutes to our friend John Pittard, if only because, at some point in December 1823, Pittard offered his own interpretation of the situation. And it is both interesting in itself and germane to the question of Christmas. Pittard mused that it might be the culture of Protestantism itself that was to blame for New York's problems. Got to blame somebody always, right? Protestants, he argued, unlike Catholics, and even pagans, had systematically suppressed the kind of religious festivals at which mechanics and laborers could find officially sanctioned and organized processions that would allow them to release their pent-up energies in satisfying but orderly ways. Pittard might also seem to be referring to Puritans in particular, rather than Protestants in general. In fact, John Pittard himself was drawn almost compulsively to ceremonies, rituals, and traditional practices for himself and his family, for New York City, and even for the United States as a nation. And when he could not find such things, he devised them. One of the nation's first antiquarians, Pittard was the founder of the New York Historical Society of 1804. And he played a role in the establishment of Washington's birthday, the 4th of July, and even Columbus Day as national holidays. Now, that's interesting. I didn't know that. In fact, it was John Pittard who brought St. Nicholas to America. Here we are. In an effort to make that figure both the icon of the New York Historical Society and the patron saint of New York City. In 1810, Pittard paid for the publication of a broadside sponsored by the Historical Society that featured a picture of St. Nicholas bringing gifts to children during the Christmas season, actually on St. Nicholas's Day, December the 6th. The picture was accompanied by a short poem that began, Santa Claus, good Hilleg man. It's spelt the way he spelt it. In his letters, Pittard regularly expressed nostalgia for what he called the old customs and ancient usages of New York, and particularly for the forgotten spirit of the old Christmas season, which rich folk and poor, old and young, would mingle together in genial harmony in the streets of the city. But Pittard never managed to discover or devise any way of observing the Christmas holidays that actually involved working class people. All of his own carefully planned seasonal rituals were restricted to the members of his own social class. For example, the formalized New Year's Day described at the beginning of this chapter. The reason for this narrowing down was clear. It had simply become impossible for New York's respectable citizens to continue participating in the rowdy old cross class. Celebrations that Pintard recalled fondly from his own youth. When he and a family servant traveled together around New York in boisterous fashion, drinking a dram at every stop and coming home loaded with sixpences. As Pintard put it in 1827, since staggering through the streets on New Year's Day is out of fashion now, it is impossible to drink drams at every house as of old. And when Pintard sorely regretted the disappearance of the goodwill that had characterized such occasions of public drinking in the olden days, he referred to this as the joyous older fashion. He also understood that the social price to be paid for that goodwill had become impossibly high. He noted that intemperance among the higher classes of our city is no longer the order of the day. Among the hospitable circles, a man would be marked who should retire intoxicated indeed. Convivial parties are all decent and sober. Sobriety had become a necessity. It is well, Pintard acknowledged with a kind sigh, it is well, for formerly New Year's was a riotous day. He quickly added, as if suddenly recalling that the real problem was a present day one, that the beastly vice of drunkenness among the lower laboring classes is growing to a frightful excess. Thefts, incendiaries, and murders, which prevail, all arise from this source. After all, that was why he founded the Society for the Prevention of Pauperism. Since there existed no Christmas rituals that were socially acceptable to the upper class, Pintard took on the responsibility of inventing them, characteristically enough, in the name of restoring something that had been forgotten. For more than 20 years, roughly between 1810 and 1830, he tried almost every year to come up with the perfect holiday. Before the late 1820s, these holidays did not involve Christmas Day itself until 1827. Pintard always observed December 25 in simple fashion as a time of prayer and private religious devotion. In the 1810s, Pintard organized and led elaborate St. Nicholas Day banquets for his fellow members of the New Year Historical Society, held at the Society's office in City Hall. But in 1820, his celebration of St. Nicholas Day was interrupted. At 6 p.m., I attended a meeting of the Pauperism Society, for even festively must not interfere with, for even festivity must not interfere with works of benevolence. That, as it happens, is the last mention of St. Nicholas Day in Pintard's published correspondence. By this time, and with an increasing intensity of commitment throughout most of the 1820s, he had turned to New Year's Day, holding lavish dinners for his extended family, and making formal visits to old friends and relatives around the city. On January 1, 1821, Pintard engaged, apparently for the first time, in what he called the good old custom of mutual visitings and cordial greetings. For the rest of the decade, he devoted each year to efforts to establish New Year's as a day of mutual visitation in New York, describing it as he did in 1822 as the custom of the simple Dutch settlers. Pintard sometimes referred to this custom with the phrase open house, but his use of the phrase is clear. Houses were open only to old friends and kin, to members of his own class. And in 1828, he ruefully admitted that the phenomenon was fading away in New York. The joyous older fashion of visitation has declined gradually. 2 years later, he explained why. the practice was becoming irksome because our city grows so extensive and friends so scattered. But by then, as we shall see, Pentard had discovered Christmas. In fact, Pentard was not only New Yorker, I'm sorry. In fact, Pentard was not the only New Yorker who expressed an interest in restoring the old customs of the Christmas season. In 1819 and 1820, there appeared a book written by a fellow member of the New York Historical Society, Washington Irving. Irving had actually written parts of the sketchbook, as he titled his new publication, at one of the tables in the Historical Society. The book was a smashing success, one that propelled Irving into sudden transatlantic celebrity. The sketchbook contained two stories that were destined to become classics: Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But it also included 5 stories about Christmas. Unlike Rip Van Winkle, those Christmas tales were not about the Dutch heritage of New York, but were set on a gracious estate in the modern British countryside, Bracebridge Hall. In these stories, Irving used Christmas as the setting for a culture in which all the classes join together in paternalist harmony. Irving's narrative is hosted at Christmas by old Squire Bracebridge, an antiquarian-minded gentleman who is obsessed with the past and who wields so much social authority that he is able to recruit the neighboring peasantry to join him in a reenactment under his direction of the holy day customs and rural games of former times. Irving's narrator waxes eloquent as he contemplates the quaint humors, the burlesque pageants, the complete abandonment of mirth and good fellowship with which this Christmas festival was celebrated. The occasion seemed to throw open every door and unlock every heart. It brought the peasant and the peer together and blended all ranks in one warm, generous flow of joy and kindness. At the climax of the Bracebridge Hall, stories, the squire presents a Christmas banquet at which are displayed, along with brawn and beef and stout home brewed, all the archaic customs of the season, including a wassail bowl, a lord of Misrule, and a group of peasants, the old squire's trusty dependents, who perform an old dance and then mingle gratefully with the squire's household. There is something genuine and affectionate in the gaiety, happiness of the lower orders. When it is excited by the bounty and familiarity of those above them, the warm glow of gratitude enters into their mirth, and a kind word, and a small pleasantry frankly uttered by a patron, gladdens the heart of the dependent more than oil and wine. It is, of course, an invention, the invention of tradition. As the historian Eric Hobsbawm has dubbed this kind of self-conscious recreation of ostensibly old-time customs, and everyone knows that. In fact, he not only knows it, he even takes pains to let us in on the secret. The narrator's description of the squire's Christmas celebration is lauded with such terms as odd and obsolete, quaint, ancient, even eccentric, and in a latter edition of the sketchbook, Irving admitted that at the time he wrote the Bracebridge Hall stories, he had never actually seen the kind of Christmas he described in it. Even the Lord of Misrule is fictive. The role is taken by a real gentleman. Nor is this all. As Squire Bracebridge drives home from church just before his great dinner party, he engages in a bit of nostalgic commentary. He begins by lamenting the deplorable decay of the games and amusements which were once prevalent at this season among the lower orders and countenanced by the higher. When the old halls of castles and manor houses were thrown open at daylight, and when rich and poor were alike welcome to enter and make merry. He put a little twist on history. As the squire continues, his nostalgia spills over into a confession of his inability to recreate the genuine rituals of Christmases past. He made them all up. And at precisely this moment, he moves from antiquarianism into political theory, Tory political theory. The nation, he continued, is altered. We have almost lost our simple, true-hearted peasantry. They have broken asunder from the higher classes and seem to think their interests are separate. They have become too knowing and begin to read newspapers, listen to House politicians, and talk of reform. I think one mode to keep them in good humor in these hard times would be for the nobility and gentry to pass one more time on their estates, mingle more among the country people, and set the merry old English games going again. And you talk about a manipulator. This is kind of fun. This is fun. All right, here we go. Wow. These guys were slick. Here we go. At this point, Irving's own narrative voice takes over from Squire Bracebridge's. Such Irving continues. Such was the good squire's project for mitigating public discontent. And indeed, he had once attempted to put his doctrine into practice. And a few years before, he kept open house during the holidays in the old style. Emphasis added. But the open house experiment failed. The country people did not understand how to play their parts in the scene of hospitality. Many uncouth circumstances occurred. These Irving do not does not choose to describe. The manor was overrun by all the vagrants of the country, and more beggars were drawn into the neighborhood in 1 week than the parish officers could get rid of in a year. He's using psychology here. So the squire was forced to back off his original project. He kind of called them out. He says that you guys aren't doing it right. And they go, "Oh, we'll show you. We'll show you we're doing it right. We're gonna go do it right." He's like, "That's exactly what I wanted." So the squire was forced to back off his original project. Nowadays, Irving tells us he contented himself with inventing the decent part of the neighboring peasantry to call at the hall on Christmas Day. Emphasis added. It is that select group, rather than the entire neighborhood, that comes to Bracebridge Hall at this stipulated time to entertain and mingle with the squire's real guest. But so self-conscious is the scene, so close to the edge of silliness, that Irving himself suspected it might ring false to contemporary readers. For as the squire mingled among the rustics and was received with the awkward demonstrations of deference and regard, Irving's narrator observes and reports to us something that escapes the notice of his host. I perceived two or three of the younger peasants as they were raising their tankards to their mouths. When the squire's back was turned, making something of a grimace and giving each other the wink. But the moment they caught my eye, they pulled grave faces and were exceedingly demure. Irving surely wrote this little scene to protect his credibility with an 1820 audience, and his meaning would have been clear enough to the knowing reader. Despite all the precautions Squire Bracebridge had taken to do the job right, he had been unable to keep even the decent part of the local peasantry in good humor on Christmas Day. The Bracebridge Hall stories were immensely popular, and they played an important part in restoring the interests of respectable Americans and Britishers in celebrating Christmas. Indeed, it was these sketches, together with the stories of Charles Dickens, that provided much of what a recent book terms the enduring imagery of Christmas, which is annually reiterated in Christmas cards and festive illustrations, where jovial squires entertain friends and retainers by roaring fires, and stout coachmen, swathed with greatcoats, urge horses down snow-covered lanes as they bring anticipatory guests and homesick relations to their welcoming destinations. When the Bracebridge Hall stories were published in 1819, they set off something of a debate about whether reviving the old rural Christmas rituals would be enough to restore the fading authority of the English gentry. The issues were understood in just three terms. One essay, published in 1825, summarized them by assuring bluntly that the merry makings of the times of Elizabeth and the Stuarts originated solely in an instinctive, paternalistic understanding between master and man, that the rich encouraged them, the merry makings, as a means of patronage and superiority, and that the poor accepted them as an oil to their chain or a happy rivet of their dependence. On those points, the essay argued conservatives and reformers agreed. Where they differed, was in their response. Conservatives believed that the old times were the best because they were least free, while reformers argued that a merry season is dearly purchased by servility all the rest of the year. This particular writer, he remains anonymous, was a skeptic. He, he, he maintained that a revival of the old rituals was unlikely to have any effect simply because the times themselves had changed. In former days, when people believed anything because a magistrate set his hand to it, the case was different. But nowadays, bring rich and poor together as we please, roast as many oxen as there are villages to do it in, and let one general wassail bowl set the hearts of great and small dancing all over England. And still, as long as there are mechanics' magazines to educate the poor, there's no fear that people will be too thankful for a sirloin of beef or melt with maudlin souls into the overflow of a beer barrel. There is, in fact, no necessity for their accepting either. Sports may be revived, this man concluded. Wassail bowls may abound, and the poor may cultivate their strength and spirits with gymnastic exercise, and the rich assuredly be no nearer an undue influence. In any event, Washington Irving's vision of Christmas did not exactly offer a practical model for anyone who was tempted, and many must have been, to celebrate Christmas in this fashion. How could John Pintard say, produce a ritual that Washington Irving himself found it difficult even to imagine for his readers? It is easy to sympathize with Pintard, who almost certainly read the sketchbook and felt the power of Irving's vision. But it was easier for Irving to imagine such a scene that for John Pintard to duplicate it, even though it may have been the Bracebridge Hall stories that inspired and finally frustrated Pintard's elaborate efforts during the 1820s to recreate the old-time New Year's Day. Pintard would not be satisfied until he discovered what had happened in the hands of his friend Clement Clarke Moore, to a figure that he himself had originally introduced, that is, of course, the figure of St. Nicholas. As late as 1826, Pintard did not associate Christmas itself with St. Nicholas or with anything at all except attending church, what Pintard termed solemnity, and devotional feelings. Pintard went to church on Christmas in 1827, too, but there was something new that year. We had St. Claus in high snuff. Pintard noted that he referred briefly to the bonbons his grandchildren had received. The following year, 1828, Pintard's description was more elaborate. All due proportions having been made by the children the preceding evening, by placing hay for his horses, and invoking St. Claus, good helling man, he came accordingly during the night with most elegant toys, bonbons, oranges, etc., all which, after filling the stockings suspended at the sides of mother's chimney, were displayed in goodly order on the mantel, to the ecstatic joy of the children in the morning, whose exultations resounded through the house. Pintard's letters from each of the years 1830 through 1832 contained descriptions that were at least as extensive as this one. By 1831, he characteristically referred to the ritual as an ancient usage, adding that St. Claus is too firmly riveted in this city ever to be forgotten. And in 1832, Pintard concluded a very lengthy account of the children's reactions to Santa's visit with these words: Happy Golden Age, all was joy and gladness. That was all there would be. Pintard lived for another dozen years, dying at the age of 85, but he was becoming blind and seems to have stopped writing letters. During the 2 decades from 1810 to 1830, when Pintard shifted his energies from December 6th to January 1st, then from January 1st to December 25, this much remained constant. The season was to be celebrated with members of his own social class. But one thing had changed nevertheless, and it was more important than the simple date of the celebration. Pintard had gradually moved from a celebration that took place in public, first at City Hall with the New York Historical Society, then on the city streets and in the houses of kinsmen and old acquaintances, to one that took place in private, in his own home, with his immediate family. Just as important, the new celebration focused on a single group within the family, young children. In a very important way, such a child-centered event was a new thing. Before the 19th century, children were merely dependents. Miniature adults who occupied the bottom of the hierarchy within the family, along with the servants. But perhaps that was exactly the point, because in another way, this was a very old thing. Making children the center of joyous attention marked an inversion of the society, of the social hierarchy, which meant that a part of the structure of an older Christmas ritual was being precisely preserved. People in positions of social and economic authority were offering gifts to their dependents. The ritual of social inversion was still there, but now it was based on age and family status alone. Age had replaced social class as the axis along which gifts were given at Christmas. The children of a single household had replaced a larger group of the poor and powerless as the symbolic objects of charity and benevolence. It was those children who became the temporary centers of attention and deference at Christmas. And the joy and gratitude on their faces and in their voices as they opened their presents was a vivid recreation of the exchange of gifts for goodwill that had long constituted the emotional heart of the Christmas season. I'm going to go a little bit longer because I'm almost done with this section. It was just such an exchange that Washington Irving had invoked in Bracebridge Hall when he insisted that there is something genuine and affectionate in the gaiety of the lower classes. Gaiety, gay used to mean joyful, happy, and that's how it's used here. When it is excited by the bounty and familiarity of those above them. Well, let me go back. I missed a section. Here we go. When he insisted that there is something genuine and affectionate in the gaiety of lower orders, when it is excited by the bounty and familiarity of those above them, how the warm glow of gratitude enters into their mirth, and a kind word and a small pleasantry frankly uttered by a patron gladdens the heart of the dependent more than oil and wine. During the 1820s, such an exchange had particular appeal for the urban upper classes, precisely because they were still residually sensitive to the need to demonstrate noblesse, especially during the Christmas season. But Irving, who continued to place the patron-client exchange in the older context of social class, was able to imagine it only with difficulty. Clement Moore, by translating the patron-client exchange from one between the classes to one between the generations, helped to transform it into a practical, simple ritual that almost any household could perform. And eventually, as we only know too well, or as we know only too well, almost every household would. Nowadays, many Americans believe, as I did until recently, that there was nothing new about the night before Christmas, described in Moore's poem. That the story it told was simply an old Dutch tradition brought to the New World in the 17th century and then, in the natural course of things, gradually Americanized. That is just what John Pintard would wish us to believe. And he may even have believed it himself. But the preeminent scholar of St. Nicholas in our own day has shown that this could not have been the case. In an article published in 1954, Charles W. Jones argued forcefully that there is no evidence that the cult of Santa Claus existed in New Amsterdam or for more than a century after British occupation. Jones pointed out that nobody has ever found any contemporaneous evidence of such a St. Nicholas cult in New York during the colonial period. Instead, the familiar Santa Claus story appears to have been devised in the early 19th century during the 2 decades that ended in the early 1820s. It seems likely that a similar ritual, along with others, was practiced in parts of Holland during the mid 17th century on St. Nicholas Day, December 6th. But Charles Jones makes a compelling case that this ritual did not cross the Atlantic, and that the Santa Claus, who was devised in early 19th century New York, was therefore a conscious reconstruction of that Dutch ritual and invented tradition. This does not mean that the night before Christmas belongs to Clement Moore alone. In fact, it was the work of a small group of antiquarian minded New York gentlemen, men who knew one another and were members of a distinct social sect. Collectively, those men became known as the Knickerbockers. The name comes from an immensely popular book published in 1809 by the best known member of the group, Washington Irving. Irving's book, commonly known as Knickerbocker's History of New York, was a brilliantly satirical allegory about life in the contemporary city that the author lived in, but it was written in the guise of a history of New Amsterdam and in Old Dutch times. Irving himself mentioned St. Nicholas 25 times in Knickerbocker's history, including references to the saint's wagon, his pipe, more of that later, and a line that read, laying his finger beside his nose. Irving even chose to have Knickerbocker's history published on St. Nicholas Day. If it was John Pintard who introduced the figure of St. Nicholas, it was Washington Irving, who popularized it. In the words of Charles W. Jones, without Irving, there would be no Santa Claus. Santa Claus was made by Washington Irving. The Knickerbocker set inhabited a special niche in the world of early 19th century New York. As a rule, its members were of British, not Dutch descent. They belonged to the Episcopal Church, and more particularly, to its ritually inclined high church faction. They were part of the wealthy old aristocracy of the city, or at least they identified with it, and they were politically conservative, reactionary, even opposed to democracy, which they identified with mob rule, and fearful of both the working class and new bourgeoisie. Interesting. Indeed, they often failed to distinguish between these two groups, sometimes lumping them together with the general, yet quite telling word plebeian. For example, in his Knickerbocker's history, Washington Irving disdainfully summarized in a single sentence an episode that clearly represented to his readers the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. Just about this time, the mob, since called the sovereign people, exhibited a strange desire of governing itself. In 1822, the year a visit from St. Nicholas appeared, John Pintard explained to his daughter just why he was opposed to the new state constitution adopted that year, a constitution that gave men without property the right to vote. All power, Pintard wrote, is to be given by the right of universal suffrage to a mass of people, especially in this city, which has no stake in society. It is easier to raise a mob than to quell it, and we shall hereafter be governed by rank democracy, a loss that the proud state of New York should be engulfed by its abyss of ruin. Ooh, sound like they had some political anxiety even back then. In short, the Knickerbockers felt that they belonged to a patrician class whose authority was under siege. From that angle, their invention of Santa Claus was part of what we can now see as a larger, ultimately quiet series cult. Oh, I'm sorry, let me try it again. From that angle, their invention of Santa Claus was part of what we can now see as a larger, ultimately quiet series cultural enterprise, forging a pseudo Dutch identity for New York, a placid folk identity that could provide a cultural counterweight to the commercial bustle and democratic misrule of early 19th century New York. The best known literary expression of this larger enterprise is Irving's classical story, Rip Van Winkle, published a full decade after Knickerbocker's history. But in the history, too, Irving pictured old New Amsterdam as a place of filial piety in which people thought and acted with characteristic slowness and circumspection, who adhere to the customs of their revered forefathers. New Amsterdam was a serene place in which people, watched over by good St. Nicholas himself, did not regulate their time by hours, but by smoking of pipes. In the next reading, we're going to do Clement Clark Moore, Country Gentleman. So that was quite a few pages. These chapters are, it's hard to get them within 30 minutes, and that's not even the full chapter. That was a subsection of the chapter, and that took 42 minutes. But a fun book, fun book. We'll learn more. And as you can see, we got quite a ways to go. You can see where my marker is. So we're going to take it all. We're going to read this all the way to the end of January if necessary, maybe even into February. I want to get through the whole book. All right, folks. God bless you guys. Thanks for watching. If you did watch and stayed with me the whole way, I appreciate you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And hope you enjoy these readings.